Okay, struck me as I was thinking about today's work is that we never did really talk about maxims per se. And so what I'd like to do is just back up a little bit and say, what is a maxim? Shortest definition would be what?
A saying.
What?
A saying.
Just a saying? What kind of a saying?
Advice.
Motto, inspiration, direction, exhortation, pithy saying. That's basically a pithy saying. There are some maxims come as literal. Can you think of a literal maxim?
Time saves 9.
It does, doesn't it? A stitch in time saves 9. That is literal, but what? It can also be a figure of speech. So, there are allegorical maxims also. Can you think of another literal one that may or may not double as allegorical? Stitch in time saves 9. Come on, what's another one?
Bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush.
Bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Which category does that work under? What? Allegorical? More than likely, yeah.
A literal one, a lost time is never found.
Lost time is never found. I'm repeating these for the, yeah, that's literal. Okay. Another one. One, Ben Franklin is famous. He did what?
Time is money.
Time is money. A penny earned. Saved is a penny earned.
Early bird gets the worm.
The early bird gets the worm. Okay. So, literal, allegorical. You can see how these interchange, right? Okay. Then there are spiritual ones, and Madai said that's what he was doing. He was writing spiritual maxims. You can Google up maxims today, and there's a magazine that just publishes spiritual maxims, and that's what they are. They're strictly spiritual, but they are basically exhortations, and they're literal. They're literal, and they are exhortatory. So, and so Madai's have a deeper tone, and I would like to propose that his are not only literal, but they also have a mystical bent. They have a subtext to them that we have to be very, very aware of. But before we go any further, let's just enjoy some maxims. These are ones that some that came from George Washington's copybook. In 1747, he was a young boy of 15, and in his personal notebook, he made a list of 110 rules for civil behavior. Okay. So here are some of them. I just love these. I'd like to read all 110 of them. Okay, here's one. It says, being to advise or reprehend anyone, consider whether it ought to be in public or private, presently or at some other time, in what terms to do it, and in reproving, show no sign of choler, but do it with all sweetness and mildness. Isn't that nice? Okay, then, this is my favorite one, though. It's number 13. This is 1747, don't forget. Kill no vermin, as fleas, lice, ticks, and so on, in the sight of others. If you see any filth or thick spittle, put your foot dexterously upon it. If it be upon the clothes of your companions, put it off privately, and if it be upon your own clothes, return thanks to him who puts it off. Isn't that fabulous? I just love it. That is just wonderful. Okay, then Rule 18, read no letters, books, or papers in company, and when there is a necessity for the doing of it, you must ask leave. Rule 38, in visiting the sick, do not presently play the physician if you be not knowing therein. 47, mock not nor jest at anything of importance, break no jests that are sharp, biting, and if you deliver anything witty and pleasant, abstain from laughing thereat yourself. That is so interesting, isn't it? Don't laugh at your own jokes. Number 50, be not hasty to believe flying reports to the disparagement of any. Rule 60, speak not of doleful things in a time of mirth or at the table. Number 108, when you speak of God and his attributes, let it be seriously and with reverence. And finally, number 10, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. And he said, the author here says, interestingly enough, these were all composed by Jesuits. They were written in Latin and translated in various languages. And so George Washington carried these maxims throughout his life. And obviously, his biographer says he obviously lived by them. So here's what they say about maxims. At first glance, the maxims read much like tips on etiquette in the manner of Emily Post or Miss Manners. But true to the Jesuit pedagogical tradition, though the immediate focus is on etiquette, the objective is moral. In other words, there is a subtext. The external emphasis is on self-discipline, modesty, humility, and mindfulness of others were meant to form a person of integral, virtuous character, wherein one's deportment revealed one's inner life and values. Hence, the pedagogical means were indirect, but the aim was moral edification. So we were talking about what makes a gentleman, that makes the gentleman.
And it's interesting to note, that George Washington was such a loved character.
Mm-hmm.
There was hardly anyone in the group of forefathers, John and his contemporaries, who didn't love him.
Yes.
He was such an attractive person. That word attractiveness is applied to him often.
Yes. And evidently he absorbed these rules. And they are rules on how to be attractive and stay attractive in the public arena. And hopefully even in the private. So on that vein, here's another set of rules, maxims by a Jesuit, Balthazar Gracian, who was the head, I think, of the University of Toledo at one time. And yes, and he wrote these maxims, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, 300 practical proposals for success by a 17th century Jesuit. Now, interestingly enough, after he had the nerve to publish these, he was sent to a little place in the outback of the Germanies and left to, he died in the village of Tarazona in the province of Zaragoza. So, no thanks to him, said the Jesuits. Okay. So I thought I would read you a few of them. Some of them are really nice, and others. Here's the first one. Every activity today requires diligence, and nothing more so than the art of making yourself count for something in the world. There is more required nowadays to deal with a single person than was required with a whole populace in former times. So you think, well, that sounds pretty good. Okay, here's number 300. In one word, be a saint. So this is to say everything at once. Virtue is the link of all perfections, the heart of all the satisfactions of life. She it is that makes a man prudent, discreet, sagacious, cautious, wise, courageous, thoughtful, trustworthy, happy, honored, truthful, and a universal hero. 3 H's make a man happy: health, holiness, and a head. Virtue is the sun of our little world and has for the sky overhead a good conscience. She is so beautiful that she finds favor with both God and man. Nothing is lovable but virtue, nothing detestable but vice. Virtue alone is important, all else is but jest. A man's capacity and greatness are to be measured by his virtue and not by his fortune. She alone is all sufficient. She makes men lovable in life and memorable after death. Now, there are a lot of in-between ones that sort of probably made people question what he was about. It says, make a graceful exit. In the house of fortune, if you enter by the gate of pleasure, you must leave by that of sorrow, and vice versa. You ought, therefore, to think of the finish and attach more importance to a graceful exit than to applause on entrance. 'Tis the common lot of the unlucky to have a very fortunate outset and a very tragic end. The important point is not the vulgar applause on entrance that comes to nearly all, but the general feeling at exit. Few in life are felt to deserve an encore. Fortune rarely accompanies anyone to the door. Warmly as she may welcome the new arrival, she speeds but coldly the parting guest. So there are all kinds of little things like that in here, but this is my favorite one. I'll read it. This is the last one I'll read. Number 110. Do not wait till you are a sinking sun. 'Tis a maxim of the wise to leave things before things leave them. One should be able to snatch a triumph at the end, just as the sun, even at its brightest, often retires behind a cloud so as not to be seen sinking, and to leave in doubt whether he has sunk or no. Wisely withdraw from the chance of mishaps, lest you have to do so from the reality. Do not wait till men give you the cold shoulder and carry you to the grave, alive on this earth but dead in their esteem. Wise trainers put racers to grass before they arouse derision by stumbling on the course. And finally, a beauty should break her mirror early, lest she do so with open eyes.
Marcia, am I correct in thinking that the salon system was still in vogue when Medai was writing, or that it had, was that at the beginning of that? Where women would hold salons?
Yeah, Paris held salons. They held salons probably by the end of the 1500s, early 1600s, maybe by 1650 they were on the wane.
Yes, the reason I'm asking
maybe,
is
no, through the 1650s.
it went into almost the 70s.
Yes.
Anyway,
in some shape or form.
because Benjamin Franklin used to go to Paris and,
Yeah.
and go to salons.
He often
The
did.
reason I'm asking is I'm wondering if Medai consulted the women in our group early on in writing the Maxims. I know they were not wealthy women, but
No.
would he have gotten any input from them
What?
in the Maxims?
This is the theory that I have always thought, is that if you read that, Elizabeth Rapley's History of the 17th Century, the Dévote, which is a record or an analysis of the devout women's groups in France, and there were Dominicans, Franciscans, many Jesuits who were spiritual guides or companions to these confraternities, and they called them also congregations. They weren't congregations as we're thinking of them today, but they were groups of devout people. And these groups were guided by somebody, usually a cleric or a member of a religious community. And sometimes these groups ask for a rule. Well, they all had rules. That was the big deal in the 17th century. But often they would ask for a rule of religious life, and so they would get one kind of rule or another. And so my theory has always been that when Madai was probably working with little groups of devout women, and maybe here and there, the way they were speaking about themselves, their understanding of what they were about and so forth, reflected what he already experienced in the Ignatian stream of spirituality. So when they asked for a rule, he gave them, as a matter of fact, a summary of the Jesuit rule. The Maxims and so on are reflections of the spiritual exercises and the summary of the Jesuit Constitution. So I like to think, too, that he was aware probably of Mary Ward, who was silenced in 1635. And her rule was suppressed, but she took the Jesuit Constitution and applied it to women. And I think he probably learned from that experience and didn't choose the Constitution itself, but the summary.
Yes, and so I was just wondering, it's almost like a symbiotic relationship between the women
And himself.
and the Madai and the Jesuit spirituality.
I think so, yeah. That for whatever reason, they were reflecting the spirituality. And so he was able to translate what they were saying into the spiritual exercises in the form of the Maxims.
So we have in a sense, a feminist version of the Jesuit.
Yes, I would agree with that. I always resisted, but the more I study the Jesuit spirituality, the Ignatian spirituality, I should say, then the more convinced I am that ours does, our early rules, the Maxims, do reflect that. And, it's perfectly wonderful spirituality, as a matter of fact. Some people think it's harsh and militaristic and so on. Well, it's a product of its time. It's culturally embedded, but at the same time it transcends that culture and even transcends ours, as we've been talking about it here. And it is based on, the humanism of the time did affect it. And so it has a positive anthropology attached to it. It comes out of a positive anthropology, whereas in Paris, the anthropology that Beyrul was using on the nobility and the wealthy patrons of the salons in Paris, it has a negative anthropology. He spoke seriously of being nothing, because he was talking to people who thought they were something. But out here in the Central Plateau, he was talking to people who knew they were nothing. And so the spirituality has a positive anthropology attached to it. Okay, anything else I want to do with this? So these are fun. Francis de Sales has a lot of maxims. His are basically spiritual and exhortatory. Nothing appeases an enraged elephant so much as the sight of a little lamb. It takes more oil than vinegar to make a good salad. What is the use of building castles in Spain when we have to live in France? I think that's really a good one, isn't it? Okay. All right, so maxims are fun. And like I said, you can Google them up any day. But don't waste your time, too much time on it, because some of them are pretty trite, I think. Okay, so what we're looking at is our own mystical text and the maxims and what they are supporting. The mysticism here supports the vocation. And remember, yesterday we talked about it as the total double union, this vocation of ours. And it also supports the rule. And the rule, Medai uses the plural form, the rules were the 6 points, right? The vocation is the total double union, and the rules are the 6 points. Plus the summary, the goal and the purpose of the association. And so the maxims then are showing us how to live this. And so today we want to just work on some themes from the maxims, which we'll get to in a minute. But just some thoughts here as we try to interpret them in our own time. It strikes me that the deeper a person goes into the journey of faith, and this applies to any age. You know, yesterday we were sort of saying, well, you know, when you're older and so on and so forth. But as I think about it, and as you look at your own faith journey, I think it applies to any age. The deeper we go into the journey of faith, then the more transparent we become to ourselves. Now just think about that for a minute. The deeper our relationship with God, then the more transparent a person is to herself. And that's key when we're reading these maxims. Because the more transparent we become to ourselves, then the more healthy self-doubt we experience. You know, when you open your mouth in a realization of self-knowledge, then immediately you begin to monitor what you are saying. You monitor your motives. You monitor the way you say it. It has to do with that exhortation from Washington, you know, should I talk to this person in public or private? You know, it moves in that direction. And the deeper we move into a relationship with God or into the faith journey, then the more the world becomes, world in quotes, becomes transparent to us. You know, the more enlightened we are, the more developed our conscience becomes, then the more we also healthily doubt the world, so to speak. World in quotes, keep that in quotes. Because our main aim, of course, is to fall in love with the world. That's the impetus of the vocation. However, there are parts of the pieces of the world's illumination or demonstration to us, its experience for us, that we doubt. And for example, you can sit and listen to a spin on the news, and what are you thinking as you listen to that? You know, you're monitoring it in your head, and you're thinking, I don't think so. When you watch certain advertisements, when you watch certain TV shows, you know, it's like we are weighing what we're hearing. We approach these things with a hermeneutic of suspicion, so to speak. An interpretation that applies prudential judgment, moral judgment to things. And we do that in light of our own self and in light of the world around us. So that's important to remember as you read these maxims. You know, like Medai is going to say, despise the world. Well, what? You know, despise the world? No. Fall in love with the world, but approach it with that hermeneutic of suspicion. Does it follow the values that we espouse? Does it reflect the vocational call of all things. You know, God is always working. God's desire is for an ecology of creation. And this exists in the real, but not in the consciousness of humans, at least. You know? And so, what God desires is that realization and cooperation with the implication of everything in everything, and the cooperation with the evolving of creation as it moves along. So if the world is not doing that, then we have a moral obligation, and that's where May is talking about that. So that God and God's desire for creation becomes the lens and the motive and the measure of the way we look at the world around us. It's the lens through which we see things. It's the motive with which we deal with it, and it's the measure of how we assess it, interpret it. So, there's always a tension between self-knowledge and knowledge of God, what God wants. What I want is in tension with what God wants, and you pick that up in the Maxims. Medai challenges that on a consistent basis. What God desires is the wholeness of creation. What is that, Romans 8? And then creation is always groaning until it realizes that wholeness, that fulfillment. And what I want is often incidental compared to that big picture. So the challenge is turning loose of the egoic self. And I finally thought of the person who talks about the egoic self rather than the egotistical self is Eckhart Tolle. Most of you probably read his books, T-O-L-L-E, Eckhart Tolle. So, you know, the challenge of turning loose of the egoic self then brings us to the dark nights and the desert. Some things we can do through self-discipline, and some things we just have to let life do its thing with us. And being finite, Medai says, Ignatius says, requires a graciousness. You know, and so Karl Rahner always said, you know, befriend the dark night. Befriend the dark night. Because that's where we learn how to be finite. Be gracious toward it. Equanimity is a Ignatian word. Okay, so with that for starters, so is there any comment on that or question? Self-knowledge. I always like to quote Betty Mossiner. She said, I prayed for self-knowledge once for a week. And that was enough. Yeah. That's why that Maxim 78, I think it is such a nice one. If you look at that for a minute, it says, glory in embarrassment and something else. And you know, what?
Glory and contempt.
Yes, glory in contempt. Is that 78? Yeah, it's 78.
Yeah.
Glory in contempt and accept embarrassment, not only patiently, but also joyfully and gratefully. That's with equanimity. It is, as a matter of fact, in embarrassment and in contempt that great souls find an endless source of grace, merit, and heavenly blessings. And you're thinking, what? Not on your life, right? Not interested, that's exactly true. Well, in the French, I love the French, it says, lodge there. Take up your abode. Logez-vous. Logez. Put everything there, yes. And you know, it's something that we would rather die than do. There's another maxim like that though, right? In your greatest troubles and difficulties, don't long for death. So what we're doing here, the challenge, did I give you one?
We need one
Sorry.
right here. We need one more.
The challenge is always to be perfectly human and to take up your abode in your finitude. Take up your abode in your humanness. Take up your abode in your humanness. Put all your stuff there. And one of the maxims, he says, be most human. Most. Be as human as you possibly can. You think, oh my God, you know, I'm so human now, then it's pitiful. But that's what self-knowledge is for, is to understand who we are and to be gracious about it. And that's where you learn compassion. And it's the compassion then that inserts you into the rest of humanity on ourselves. Self-knowledge and then learning to live with ourselves graciously goes a long way. So, but Madai says, you know, there's certain limitations to being human that all the self-help books in the world are not going to improve on. And you certainly know that as you get older. You know, there are certain obstacles that are not going to go away. And so how do you be fully human with those obstacles and fully human graciously? So, Nancy, your question about zeal, that's half a zeal. And, you know, I think that the generous courage that compassion generates, that being one with, is what impels us into the world. It opens our eyes to what the world needs and how we want to be present in it. And Madai says, you know, that's what's important, and you do it in any way of which you're capable. You know, if you can teach, teach. If you can nurse, nurse. But if you can just sit and listen to people, then sit and listen to people. You know, and in one part of the rule, he says, you know, your work is formation of life. Formation of life. So, you know, however you can do that, that's what we contribute. Okay, what I'd like to do is just look at the back side of this paper. Punch the holes on the wrong side, just to prove to myself a limitation in the sensate department. Okay. So, I just picked out a few of the themes. Every time I do this, I do it differently, but I think some of these will stick. Humility, magnanimity, indifference, modesty, douceur, self-givenness, glory, and finding God in all things. So, you might have your Maxim book open at your place. Hang on to it. So let's just look at humility and finitude. Just take a couple of examples. And look at Maxim 3. It's a good one. There are practically everyone in here is that, but so Madai starts out, this is the second point, by the way, in the goal of association, but he uses it as a maxim also. So he starts out with Philippians 2, and then he says, make your commitment to live in the practice of the most sincere, the most sincere, true, and profound humility possible to you. Notice there's just a little bit of a slippage there, which is good. That's healthy. The most sincere, true, and profound humility that you're capable of. Be human on all occasions, to everyone, and especially to God, from whom must come all the blessings of your institute. So there's no room really for perfectionism in here, as we used to know it, right? There is every room for everybody to be as human as possible, so that the compassion, we live and lead out of compassion. 7, of course, number 7, is the maxim of zeal. And there you see the magnanimity coupled with the finitude. In the manifestation of zeal, characteristic of your humble vocation. Now notice, he's talking about a particular zeal. So in the world, in the popular mode, you use zeal all the time, right? And that's fine, but it's not the Ignatian sense. So when you're thinking about your particular engagement with it, then you're looking at Maxim 7. We are looking at Maxim 7. In the manifestation of zeal, characteristic of your very humble vocation, imitate the fervor of the most zealous, and embrace and desire the salvation and perfection of a whole world in a spirit replete with a true humility and a generous courage. This will bring you to wish to do everything, to suffer everything, and to undertake everything for the advancement of the glory of God and the salvation of the dear neighbor. So, true finitude coupled with the generosity and the courage it takes to be finite, human, and frees us to do anything that will advance the welfare, the common good, and so on, of the neighbor, however we define neighbor. We will go to any length to do that. So his definition of magnanimity is generous courage. Generous courage. All right, I want to call your attention while we're right here on page 28 to Maxim 89. Okay, do you have that? Mm-hmm. All right. It says, profit from the opportunities that arise to practice the general virtues in their highest degree. And then the footnote down there says, occasions to practice magnanimity do not often present themselves, but gentleness, moderation, humility are among the virtues which should color all our actions, and hence are called the general virtues. That's from Francis de Sales' Introduction to a Devout Life. Now, the people that Francis de Sales was writing to, the gentle women, mostly of his age, in the early part of the 17th century, last part of the 16th, he was not encouraging them to practice magnanimity. This was one of the great virtues. But Medai comes right out and inserts it in the Maxims, saying that if we're going to be perfectly human, we also have to have that virtue of magnanimity. We have to be magnanimous. Magnanimity is the great-heartedness that goes with being as fully human as possible. And that's prescribed for. Okay, so you'll find these two things, zeal, the one thing, over and over in the Maxims. Like there's always this openness, this readiness, and coupled with finitude. That's the way Madai talked about saying and unsaying. If he says in one maxim, you're hopelessly human, he says and unsays it in the next one saying, go for broke, you can do it. And so you watch for that. Don't get hung up on, he's contradicting himself. No, he's saying that everything is in attunement. We bear it all in the same person or in the one community. It's a mystical vision of humanity and ourselves in particular. Okay, indifference. And if we move, let's look at numbers 5 and 6 just for. Okay, esteem the world and its vanities no more than dung. Let the world be crucified to you and you to it. That is to say, despise the world which is only illusion and reject its maxims which are full of deceit and impiety. So I already talked about that. That's Madai is quoting the epistles, Galatians and 1 Corinthians. The main thing is that we take we've got our eye on the one thing necessary. It's a single-hearted movement for us. And so when we are measuring values in the world, it's sort of a mental censorship. Is this about the one thing necessary? What am I drawn to? And then the world crucified to us and us to the world. And that is one of the most intimate things ways to be in the world. The suffering of the world, nailed to it, or nailed to us. And that's where our compassion leads. And so, he said, let the world be crucified to you and you to it. So he's saying that here's a saying and an unsaying. The world needs to be suspect, and yet it needs to be one with us in this terrible intimacy of suffering. And so, you just think about what's going on in the world today. What is a movement in the world that is terribly suspect? That you immediately suspect, or you're looking at it with doubt through the hermeneutics of suspicion.
Trafficking.
What?
Trafficking.
Trafficking.
Human trafficking.
But nobody's defending human trafficking. That would be the suffering that we would take upon ourselves.
U.S. Congress.
What?
The U.S. Congress.
The U.S. Congress. Basically, what are they saying? Obama is trying to say now that he's going to be working with them. They're going to be working with him. And so most of us are looking at that with a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? Okay. So there's something that we will watch with doubt and yet with openness. Because we're talking about the immigration. For one thing, the big deal right now is immigration. The immigration policies, the laws that will govern immigration. So the immigrants, we know, we are intimately involved with immigration. So we are measuring with our values how Congress deals with immigration. And despise the world which is only illusion. You know, how many more guards, how many more miles of wall do we really need to keep immigrants out of our southern borders? Reject those maxims that are full of deceit and impiety. And then in the same vein he goes on, put aside your old self so that you can put on the new, from Ephesians. Lead a life that's dead to the world and to self-love, full of gentleness, humility of heart, true sincerity, modesty, interior and exterior peace, and of charity toward the neighbor. In a word, a life completely modeled on the holiness and pleasing virtues of Jesus, which you should develop in yourself. Now, he goes through this whole thing about living a life dead to the world, and then he says, take on the pleasing virtues of Jesus, who threw himself into the world. You know? So how does this become one in us? How was it one in Jesus?